Evelyn Crow had a fortune, a name, and a future, until the night she found the ledgers that were never meant to be found. In less than 48 hours, her own father had her declared insane, her inheritance stolen, and armed men dragging her toward an asylum she would never leave. She ran. She ran all the way to the edge of the American wilderness, where the snow swallowed her whole and left her dying in the dark. What happened next would either destroy her completely or turn her into something the world had never seen before. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything you had, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Philadelphia in the winter of 1883 wore its wealth like armor. The mansions along Rittenhouse Square burned with gaslight from every window, their facades scrubbed white as bone, their iron gates polished to a mirror shine even in February. Horse-drawn carriages rolled over cobblestones slicked with ice, and the people who climbed in and out of them moved with the particular carelessness of those who had never once worried about where their next meal was coming from. They wore their furs and their diamonds and their practiced smiles, and they spoke about art and politics and other people's scandals, and they never ever spoke about anything that actually mattered. Evelyn Crow had grown up inside that world. She knew its rhythms the way a caged bird knows the dimensions of its cage, not with affection, but with a bone-deep, inescapable familiarity. She was 26 years old, and she had never once chosen her own breakfast. That was not an exaggeration. Every meal, every dress, every appointment, every conversation at every dinner party had been arranged, approved, and sometimes outright scripted by her father, Senator Edmund Crow, a man who had built one of the largest private fortunes in Pennsylvania, not through any particular genius, but through an absolute willingness to crush anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. He was not a violent man by nature. He preferred paperwork. He preferred the quiet devastation of lawyers and signed documents and social ruin. Violence, he always said, was for men who lacked imagination. Evelyn had inherited his mind, but not his cruelty. That distinction had made her entire life an exercise in invisible suffering. She stood now at the window of her third-floor bedroom, watching the snow fall over Rittenhouse Square with a glass of cold tea in her hand that she hadn't drunk. The Crow estate blazed behind her, a 40-room monument to her father's appetite, every surface gilded or carved or draped in something that cost more than most men earned in a decade. She could hear the party downstairs. She could hear the laughter and the clinking glasses, and the low, satisfied rumble of powerful men congratulating each other on their own continued existence. Tonight was Lucian Harrow's celebration dinner. Lucian had just secured another railroad contract through the federal government, a line that would cut straight through 3 territories and carry goods from Denver all the way to the Pacific coast. Everyone in that dining room was toasting his name and drinking his expensive imported whiskey and shaking his hand like it was made of gold. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She had been engaged to Lucian Harrow for 11 months. She was supposed to marry him in April. The thought sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. Lucian Harrow was 41 years old and had the face of a man who had been handsome once and knew it, which was somehow worse than never having been handsome at all. He was tall, well-dressed, and possessed of an effortless social grace that people consistently mistook for genuine warmth. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered names and anniversaries and the particular preferences of the people whose approval he needed. He gave generously to charitable causes when the newspapers were watching, and not at all when they weren't. Evelyn had known what he was for almost as long as she'd known him. She had tried early on to tell her father. She had been measured and careful about it. She'd brought specific observations, specific concerns, specific incidents she had witnessed that didn't add up. Her father had listened with the patient expression of a man humoring a child's nightmare, and then he had explained very gently that she was young and idealistic, and that she would understand men better once she was older, and that Lucian was not only an excellent match but a necessary one, and that this conversation was finished. That had been 14 months ago. Evelyn had learned to stop talking and start watching instead. The study where she found the ledgers was on the ground floor of the East Wing, behind the library. It was her father's private office, the room he kept locked even from the household staff, and she should not have been in it. She had not intended to be in it. She had slipped away from the party upstairs to find some quiet, had taken a wrong turn in the dark, and had found the door standing open by a half-inch, gaslight flickering inside. She pushed it open. Her father was not there. Neither was Lucian. 2 glasses of whiskey sat on the desk, both recently poured, alongside an open leather satchel and 3 thick ledger books spread across the mahogany surface. Someone had left in a hurry. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the muffled noise of the party above her, the creak of the house settling in the cold. Then she crossed the room and looked at what was on the desk. The first ledger was a shipping manifest. She recognized the format. Her father dealt in imports as a side venture, and she had seen similar documents before. But these weren't cloth or furniture or any of the commodities her father publicly traded. The columns listed crates, dozens of crates, sometimes hundreds. They were labeled with numbers, not descriptions. Beside each number was a destination, territorial outposts, frontier settlements, small railroad depots in the Western Territories. Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico. The second ledger was a financial record. The numbers were enormous, tens of thousands of dollars per transaction, sometimes more. She recognized several names in the payment columns. Politicians, a general, a federal land commissioner she had met at a dinner party the previous spring. The third ledger was the one that made her hands start shaking. It was a correspondence log. Summaries of letters sent and received, written in a tight, precise hand she didn't recognize. But some of the phrases she did recognize. She had heard Lucian use them, private phrases, almost like a code, that she had assumed were personal affectations. The iron remedy. The clearing of the field. Territory made available. She read faster now, her eyes jumping between lines, her mind pulling together a picture she desperately did not want to see. The crates in the shipping manifest contained weapons. Rifles, mostly. Some artillery. All of it acquired outside of any legal procurement process and shipped west through Lucian's railroad network under false commercial manifests. The weapons were being supplied to specific factions in the territories, men who used them to clear settlers, to crush labor organizing in the mining camps, to enforce the particular version of order that benefited the people whose names appeared in the financial ledger. The clearing of the field was not a metaphor. Evelyn stood in her father's study with her hands pressed flat against the open ledger and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Outside this room, 40 feet above her head, her father and her fiancé were laughing over expensive whiskey. The cold in her chest was not from the winter air coming through the window gaps. It was something older than cold. Something that happened when a person finally understood the exact shape of the cage they'd been living in. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Without thinking, she grabbed all 3 ledgers, shoved them under her arm, and pressed herself into the corner behind the open door. 2 men passed in the hallway. She recognized their voices. Her father's private secretary and one of Lucian's associates. They were talking about the party. They did not enter the study. She waited until the footsteps faded, then walked very quickly and very quietly back toward the stairs. She went to her father at midnight. She had considered waiting. She had considered going directly to someone outside the family, a lawyer, a journalist, a federal authority. But she was Edmund Crow's daughter, and she had been raised inside his world, and some part of her, the part that was still, despite everything, hoping she was wrong, needed to hear what he would say. She knocked on his bedroom door. He answered in his dressing gown, candle in hand, with the particular expression of a man who was not surprised to be interrupted. "Evelyn." He looked at the ledgers under her arm. His face did not change. That was the first terrible sign. "Come inside." She laid the 3 ledgers on his writing table and told him what she had read. She was methodical about it. She had organized her thoughts on the walk upstairs. She told him the shipping manifests, the financial records, the correspondence log, the names, the amounts, the destinations. She told him what she believed it meant. She told him she thought they needed to go to the federal authorities immediately, before Lucian realized the ledgers were missing. Her father listened with his hands folded in his lap, and his face arranged in an expression of careful attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you find those?" "Your study. The door was open." "My study was locked." "The door was open," she repeated. "I didn't break in." He reached across the table and took the ledgers. He did not open them. He simply placed them in his desk drawer and turned the key in the lock and put the key in his dressing gown pocket. Then he looked at her with the same expression she had seen 14 months ago when she had tried to tell him about Lucian, and he said, "Go to bed, Evelyn." "Father, go to bed." The gentleness in his voice was more frightening than anger would have been. "We'll speak about this in the morning." She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and told herself she was overreacting. She told herself he was going to handle it quietly, through the right channels, the way he handled everything. She told herself she trusted him. She sat in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and tried very hard to believe the things she was telling herself. At 3 in the morning, she heard the door, not her bedroom door, the front door of the house, opening and closing. Then voices on the stairs. Then footsteps. Then her bedroom door opened without a knock, and 2 men she had never seen before walked in carrying a doctor's bag and a set of leather restraints. Behind them stood her father. He looked tired. "This is for your own protection," he said. "You've been under considerable strain. Dr. Whitmore believes a period of rest and treatment will—" Evelyn was already moving. She did not scream. Screaming felt like the wrong thing to do, even though every nerve in her body was firing at once. She went sideways off the bed, away from the men in the doorway, to the window. The latch was still unlocked from when she'd been watching the snow earlier. "Evelyn." Her father's voice had shifted. The gentle tone was gone and something flatter had replaced it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "You were going to let me marry him," she said. Her own voice surprised her. It was steady, which made no sense. "You already knew. You already knew what he was doing, and you were going to let me marry him." Edmund Crowe said nothing. One of the men took a step toward her. She threw the window open and went out onto the narrow ledge. What followed was not graceful. She was wearing a nightgown and no shoes, and the temperature outside was somewhere below 20 degrees. The ledge was 2 inches wide and slicked with frost. She made it 6 feet before she lost her footing, caught herself on a drainpipe, and hung there for a moment in the dark Philadelphia air, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Below her was a snow-covered garden, maybe 15 feet down. She dropped. She hit the snow hard and wrong, rolled, came up limping on her left ankle, and ran. She had no coat, no shoes, no money. She was wearing a cotton nightgown in a Philadelphia winter, and she ran barefoot through the frozen garden and through the gate and out into the street. 3 blocks away, she found a livery stable and a groom sleeping on duty who woke to find a barefoot, frostbitten woman in his employer's doorway and made the decision to help her. A decision he would probably question for years afterward, but which he made in the moment without apparent hesitation, which said something about the look on her face. He gave her an old coat from a nail by the door and a pair of boots 2 sizes too large and $20 from his own pocket. "Where are you going?" he asked. Evelyn was already out the door. "West," she said. She rode a night train out of Philadelphia and did not stop moving for 4 days. She changed trains in Pittsburgh, in Cincinnati, in St. Louis. She bought cheap food at station counters and ate standing up and kept her collar turned against the cold and her eyes on every door. She had $4 left by the time she crossed into Kansas, because the first 3 trains had required tickets she shouldn't have been able to buy, and she had bought them anyway on a kind of furious momentum that she suspected would collapse the moment she stopped. In Kansas City, she sat in the depot for 2 hours trying to think clearly for the first time since Philadelphia. She had a cousin, Margaret Crowe, her father's niece, actually, who had married a mining engineer named Aldous Whitfield and gone west to the Colorado Territories 8 years ago. Evelyn had met her twice. Both times, Margaret had seemed like the kind of person who existed outside the normal rules, practical, direct, uninterested in appearances. They had exchanged letters a handful of times over the years. It wasn't much to build a plan on, but it was something. She bought a ticket to Denver and then a connecting fare to the mining town of Black Hollow, up in the mountain district south of Denver, where the last letter from Margaret had been postmarked. The train ride into the mountains took 2 days. The landscape changed so dramatically as they climbed that Evelyn found herself pressing her face against the window like a child. The flat eastern plains giving way to foothills, then pine forests, then something enormous and indifferent, all gray stone and white snow and distances so vast they made the eyes ache. She had never been west of Ohio. She had spent her entire life in a city that believed itself to be the center of the universe. Looking out at the Rockies for the first time, she thought, no wonder people disappear out here. Black Hollow was not what she had imagined. She had pictured a rough but functioning town, saloons and mercantiles and a sheriff's office and people working, all the activity of a frontier settlement in full operation. What she found instead was a town that had seen better years and wasn't sure it would see many more. The silver mine that had built the place had flooded out 18 months earlier, and a good third of the population had already packed up and left. The main street had businesses with their windows papered over. The hotel had a sign out front promising hot water that clearly hadn't been true for some time. The first person she asked about Margaret Whitfield looked at her with an expression she didn't understand. The second person told her the truth. Margaret Whitfield had died of pneumonia 6 weeks earlier. Her husband had already left for Denver with what remained of their property. Evelyn stood in the middle of Black Hollow's main street in the February cold and processed this information. Around her, the town went about its thin, exhausted business. A dog crossed the street. Somewhere, someone was hammering. The sound carried a long way in the cold air. She had $4.50. She was 1,200 miles from Philadelphia. Her father had almost certainly filed legal papers declaring her mentally incompetent. She had heard enough law discussed at dinner parties to know that was possible, that a wealthy man with the right connections could do it in a matter of days. Her inheritance was almost certainly already frozen. Her name would be in the papers, probably described in the gentlest and most condescending possible language. She could not go back east. Not yet. Not until she could find a way to expose what she'd seen in those ledgers. But she could not stay in Black Hollow either. She found the one remaining hotel and negotiated 2 nights' lodging in exchange for helping in the kitchen. The proprietress, a woman named Mrs. Hatch, who had the demeanor of someone who had been disappointed by life but intended to outlast it, looked at Evelyn's ruined boots and city coat and made a judgment call that worked out in Evelyn's favor. "There are people who cross the mountains this time of year," Mrs. Hatch told her, over a supper of beans and salt pork that Evelyn ate so fast she nearly choked. "There's a pass that's sometimes navigable in early February if the weather holds." "I need to get to Denver," Evelyn said. "I need to get to a federal marshal's office." Mrs. Hatch looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has heard many stories and believes very few of them, but is willing to withhold judgment. "I know a man named Clyde Garrett, who hires himself out as a mountain guide. Not the best option, but he's the only one who'd go this time of year." Evelyn hired Clyde Garrett the next morning for $3.50, which was nearly everything she had left. She kept the 50 cents. Clyde Garrett was 50-something, rope-thin, and possessed of a restless, calculating quality that Evelyn noticed immediately, but attributed to the general roughness of the frontier. He had a horse and a mule, and he knew the mountain pass well enough. She could see that in the first hour of riding, in the way he read the terrain without apparent thought. What she did not see, because she didn't know what to look for, was the way he looked at her bags. Twice in the first hour, and then again at noon when they stopped to let the animals drink at a partially frozen stream. The first day of the crossing went reasonably well. The weather was overcast but not threatening. They climbed steadily through pine forest, the air thinning and the cold growing with each hour. Garrett spoke little, which she found comforting. She was too tired for conversation. They camped in a shallow rock shelter at dusk, and Evelyn ate the last of the bread and dried meat she'd bought in Black Hollow, and tried to sleep while the temperature dropped and the wind began to pick up in the darkness above the tree line. By morning, the sky had changed. Garrett studied it at first light with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Weather's moving in," he said. "How bad?" "Hard to say. Could pass over us." He said it with a flatness that didn't match the question, and she looked at him, and for a moment something passed between them. A moment of almost recognition, like a word on the tip of the tongue. Then he turned away and began saddling the horse. They rode for 3 more hours before the storm hit. It came from the northwest, which Garrett had been watching all morning, and it came fast. What had been overcast and cold became, in the space of 20 minutes, a whiteout, wind driving horizontally, snow so dense it reduced visibility to less than 10 feet, the temperature dropping so rapidly she could feel it against her skin, even through every layer she wore. Garrett pulled his horse alongside hers and had to shout to be heard. "There's a shelter another hour up. We pushed through." She nodded. There was nothing else to do. But as the hour wore on, the trail, which she'd been navigating by following Garrett's horse, began to change. They were descending when they should have been climbing. The terrain felt wrong in a way she couldn't have precisely defined but felt with growing certainty. She called out to Garrett. He didn't answer. She tried again, louder. The wind took her voice and tore it apart. She pushed her mule forward, following the shape of horse and rider ahead of her through the white, and then the shape wasn't there anymore. She was alone in the blizzard on the side of a Colorado mountain, and it took her exactly 4 seconds to understand what had happened. Garrett had taken the pass they'd discussed, the shelter, the route to Denver, and left her to follow a deer trail that went nowhere. She pulled the mule to a stop and stood in the driving snow and understood that she was going to die here. The mule was struggling. She could feel it in the animal's gait. It was going sideways to the wind, skittish and exhausted. The cold was already inside her coat. Her fingers were numb. She had no shelter, no landmarks, no sense of direction in the whiteout. The trail Garrett had left her on was already obliterated under new snow. She kept moving because stopping felt final. She moved in what she thought was a downhill direction, which was all she had. Down was at least a direction. Down might mean tree line eventually. Down was better than up in a blizzard. The mule gave out first. It stopped, planted its feet, and refused to move in a way that was absolute and non-negotiable. The way animals get when they've decided something before you have. She slid off its back and stood in knee-deep snow in the dark. Colorado afternoon, and thought, with strange calm, that she had run from one kind of death in Philadelphia to find a different kind of death here, and that there was something almost funny about that, except that she was too cold to laugh. She was walking, stumbling really, because her feet had gone past numb to something she couldn't feel at all, when the snow in front of her moved. Not winged, not snow shifting on a slope, something large moving through the blizzard toward her. She had stopped being afraid about an hour earlier, which probably said something about the state she was in. She stood in the snow and watched the shape materialize out of the white and resolve into the figure of a man. Tall, enormously tall, wrapped in layers of hide and wool, moving through the storm as though the storm was just weather and not the end of the world. He stopped when he saw her. She saw his face for half a second. Dark eyes, a scar cutting across one cheek, a beard full of ice crystals. And then she fell. She didn't feel herself fall. One moment she was standing, the next, the white was above her instead of in front of her, and the cold was suddenly very distant, and she thought distantly that the snow actually wasn't bad. It was almost warm, and then she stopped thinking entirely. She woke up warm. That was the first sensation, warmth, genuine and bone deep, which her body registered as so profoundly wrong after what it had been experiencing that she gasped and sat upright before she was fully conscious. She was on a narrow wooden bed covered in heavy furs. The room was small and low-ceilinged, logs, rough-hewn, no plaster, with a stone fireplace on one wall burning hard, orange light filling the space. The floor was covered in pelts. Rifles hung in a rack beside the door. A single oil lamp on a table beside the fire. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters alongside what looked like strips of cured meat. The room smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and cold air, and something metallic that she would later identify as gun oil. Sitting at the table, back to her, sharpening a knife with the slow, methodical strokes of someone who had been doing it for a long time, was the largest man she had ever seen. "You're awake," he said. He didn't turn around. Evelyn opened her mouth and discovered her throat was so dry that sound required effort. "Yes," she managed. "Don't try to stand yet. Your feet need another hour." She looked down. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth and positioned near the fire on a folded blanket. She couldn't feel them still, but there was a faint prickling at the edges that suggested feeling was returning. "I'm Evelyn Crow," she said. She said it the way she had been trained to say it, with the slight upward lift at the end that expected recognition. It was a reflex, ingrained from childhood. She regretted it immediately. The man didn't respond to the name. He turned the knife in his hands and tested the edge with his thumb. "I know who you are," he said. That stopped her. "What?" "Your name's been in the Denver papers." He still hadn't turned around. "Senator's daughter, declared mentally unsound, fled family care." He paused. "That what happened?" Evelyn stared at the back of his head. She had expected many things from this conversation, not this. "No," she said. "That is not what happened. Figured." He finally turned and she got her first real look at him. The dark eyes she'd half seen in the blizzard, the scar, the beard, the width of his shoulders, which was genuinely remarkable. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. He looked at her the way she imagined a wolf might look at something it was considering, not with violence, but with a complete, unblinking assessment. "I'm Gideon Vale." The name landed with weight she hadn't expected. She had heard it, as it turned out. She had heard it in Black Hollow, in Mrs. Hatch's kitchen, spoken in the low tone that people reserve for things they were half afraid to say out loud. Gideon Vale, the outlaw. The mountain man who'd killed 3 men in a mining dispute down near Pueblo, who'd vanished into the high Rockies and wasn't seen for months at a time, who the territorial marshal's office had on a list and hadn't managed to locate despite apparently genuine efforts. She looked at him sitting at his table in his cabin with his knife and his steady dark eyes, and she thought, I'm in a great deal of trouble, or I am entirely safe, and I cannot tell which. Thank you, she said, for pulling me out of the snow. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Don't thank me yet, he said. Storm's going to last 2 more days at least. You're not going anywhere. He stood, set the knife on the table, and moved to the fire. He moved quietly for a man his size, she noticed, with the careful economy of someone accustomed to closed spaces and the necessity of not disturbing things. He put another log on. Then he took a pot from the shelf beside the fireplace and hung it on the iron hook over the flames. You need to eat, he said. When you can feel your feet again, eat, then sleep. We'll talk after that. What will we talk about? He looked at her over his shoulder. How you ended up alone in a blizzard on the east face of Mount Agnes in February. A pause. And who sent the man who left you there? Evelyn stared at him. The mule, he said. I found the mule. Saddled, bridled, traveling with expensive bags still attached. Whoever left you there was in a hurry, or didn't care about the money. He turned back to the pot. And from the boots on your feet when I found you, you weren't dressed for mountain travel. Someone put you on that mountain knowing you wouldn't come off it. The fire popped. Outside, the storm hammered against the log walls with a sound like the world trying to get in. Evelyn Crow lay back against the firs and looked up at the rough-hewn ceiling of a mountain outlaw's cabin and thought about her father's face when she had laid those ledgers on his table. The gentleness in his voice. We'll speak about this in the morning. Yes, she said quietly. Someone did. Gideon Vale said nothing. He stirred whatever was in the pot with a long wooden spoon and did not ask her anything more, and she was grateful for that. She was too tired and too cold and too recently nearly dead to explain everything right now. She would tell him. She didn't know why she was certain of that, but she was. She would tell this man with the scarred face and the steady eyes and the cabin full of rifles everything she had seen in her father's study. Outside, the storm screamed on. Inside, the fire burned. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Evelyn Crow was, despite everything, still alive. She slept for 14 hours. Not the restless, half-conscious dozing she'd managed on the trains west. Real sleep, the kind that pulled her under completely and held her there, dark and dreamless, until her body decided it had taken enough and pushed her back up to the surface. When she opened her eyes, the fire had burned down to coals, and the light coming through the single small window in the cabin wall was the flat, white light of daytime under heavy cloud cover. The storm was quieter, still present, still pressing against the logs with a low, constant moan, but the screaming intensity of the night before had eased to something more manageable. Snow had drifted against the window until the light came through. It diffused and blew white, like being inside a lantern. Gideon was not in the cabin. She sat up carefully and tested her feet. They hurt. A sharp, itching, burning pain that was actually reassuring because it meant they were working. She unwrapped the cloth he'd bound them in and inspected the damage. Her toes were an ugly reddish purple, and the skin of her left heel had blistered, but nothing looked black. Nothing looked dead. She'd been lucky, or he'd found her exactly in time. Or both. She stood. Her legs held barely. On the table where he'd been sitting the night before, there was a tin cup and a covered pot. She lifted the lid, beans kept warm by proximity to the coals, with a heel of dark bread beside it. She sat at the table and ate with the focused attention of someone who has stopped tasting food and is simply fueling a machine, and she looked around the cabin properly for the first time. It was not a comfortable space. It was a functional one, which was different. Every object in the room had a purpose and was positioned in relation to that purpose. The rifles in their rack, cleaned and loaded, positioned near the door within easy reach. The pelts on the floor, insulating against the cold that came up through the ground. The dried goods on the shelves, organized not for aesthetics but for access, the things used most frequently at eye level. There were no decorative objects, no photographs, no evidence of sentiment, but there were books. She hadn't noticed them the night before. A short shelf above the fireplace. The spines cracked, and the covers worn. She could read a few titles from where she sat. A geological survey of the Colorado territories. A military history. Something in what looked like French. a battered copy of Moby Dick with a strip of leather marking somewhere near the middle. She was looking at the books when the door opened and cold air and Gideon Vale entered the cabin simultaneously. He was carrying firewood under one arm and a dead rabbit in his other hand, and he was coated in snow from the shoulders up, which he knocked off against the doorframe before kicking the door shut behind him. He clocked her immediately, sitting at the table, eating, upright. And something in his expression shifted slightly, though she couldn't have described exactly what changed. "Good," he said. He dropped the wood beside the fireplace and hung the rabbit on a hook near the door. "You have Melville," she said. He turned and looked at her, then at the shelf, then back at her. "Problem with that?" "No, I'm surprised, that's all." People are always surprised. He said it without apparent offense, like it was simply an observation he'd made many times. He crouched at the fireplace and began rebuilding the fire with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times. Moby Dick's the best American novel written. Doesn't require you to be a particular kind of person to read it. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the tin cup and felt the warmth of it against her palms. "What kind of person do people assume you are?" He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "What kind do you?" "I haven't decided yet," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the fire. "Fair enough." The fire caught. He fed it until it was going solidly, then pulled the second chair to the table and sat down across from her. He was closer now than he'd been the night before, and she was struck again by the sheer physical fact of him. The size, the scarring, the quality of stillness he carried that was different from passivity. It was the stillness of something that had learned to be patient because patience was a survival skill. "Tell me about the man who left you on the mountain," he said. So she told him. Not everything. Not yet. She told him about Garrett, about the route, about the way the storm came in, and the moment she realized she was following a deer trail going nowhere. She described the abandoned mule, the walk through the whiteout, the point at which she'd stopped being afraid because she'd run out of the capacity for it. Gideon listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that was different from the listening she was accustomed to. The performative attention of dinner party guests, the careful strategic listening of lawyers and politicians. He listened the way a person listened when they actually needed the information, with his eyes steady on her face and his hands still on the table. "Garrett," he said when she'd finished. "Clyde Garrett. Works out of Black Hollow. You know him?" "Know of him. He's been hired before to lose people in the mountains." His voice was flat, factual. "Someone paid him well to make sure you didn't reach Denver." The directness of it landed in her chest like something physical. She had known it. She'd understood it lying in the snow. She'd said as much to Gideon the night before. But hearing it stated plainly in the quiet of the cabin, with the storm outside and the fire between them, made it real in a different way. "My father," she said. "Or the man he's protecting." She set down the tin cup. "Lucian Harrow. He's a railroad magnate. She stopped. "I was engaged to him." Gideon's expression didn't change. He waited. "I found ledgers in my father's study 3 weeks ago. Evidence that Harrow has been using his railroad network to smuggle weapons into the Western Territories. Large quantities. Rifles, artillery. Sold to men who use them to clear settlers, crush labor organizing, take land." She kept her voice steady. "The ledgers named names, politicians, military officers, a federal land commissioner. It wasn't a small operation. It's been running for years." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Gideon sat with what she'd told him for a long moment before he spoke. "And your father's in it." "He's not just in it. He and Harrow run it together." Saying it out loud, plainly, without qualifications or careful hedging. It felt like setting down a weight she'd been carrying since Philadelphia. "I took the ledgers to him because I thought, I don't know what I thought, that he'd help. That there was some version of my father that was different from what those documents described." She paused. "There wasn't." "No," Gideon said simply. "They had me declared mentally incompetent within hours. My inheritance is frozen. There are probably warrants issued. And my father sent a hired guide to make sure I died in the mountains before I could reach anyone with jurisdiction." She said it as steadily as she could. It was still her father. That part didn't go away just because she said it plainly. Gideon looked at her with the direct, unadorned attention she was starting to recognize as simply the way he looked at things. "You have proof?" "The ledgers. I don't have them anymore. Garrett took my bags. Everything I had was in those bags." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "But I read them. I have names, amounts, dates, destinations. I remember most of it. My father trained me from childhood to memorize financial documents. A hard, short sound that was almost a laugh. He wanted me to be useful at dinner parties, to remember who owned what and for how much. He didn't consider that I might remember the wrong documents someday. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not exactly approval, too subtle for that, and she had the sense approval was not something he distributed casually, but something. The storm breaks in 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. Then we figure out what to do with what you remember. We? She said it without thinking. He looked mildly uncomfortable for a fraction of a second. You're not going to make it back down this mountain alone. Not in February. Not with Garrett still somewhere between here and Black Hollow. I understand. I wasn't... She stopped. Thank you. Stop thanking me. You keep saying that. You keep doing it. He stood and moved back toward the fire, picking up the long-handled spoon. It makes you sound like you're surprised someone helped you. Gets old. Evelyn Crow sat at the rough wooden table of Gideon Vale's mountain cabin and looked at the back of a man the world called a murderer, and thought that there was a particular cruelty in how thoroughly the wrong people got the worst reputations. The storm pressed against the walls. The fire burned. She finished her bread. The 2 days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised her. She had expected tension, the brittle, exhausting vigilance of being in an unfamiliar space with an unfamiliar person whose intentions she couldn't fully read. What she found instead was something more like the quiet of 2 people learning the dimensions of a shared space and adjusting to each other without making a production of it. Gideon was not warm, exactly. He didn't tell her stories about himself or ask the kind of questions people asked when they wanted to seem interested. But he was not cold either. He was simply present, functioning, practical, occasionally blunt in a way that she found, unexpectedly, easier to deal with than the elaborate social performance she had grown up navigating. When she asked him something directly, he answered directly. When she said something incorrect, he said so without cruelty but without softening it either, which she appreciated more than she'd expected to. On the first full day, he taught her to maintain the fire properly. Not just feed it, but read it, understand what it needed and when. It seemed like a small thing. It wasn't. She had never once in her life needed to manage her own heat source, and learning something so basic at 26 produced a combination of embarrassment and fierce concentration that apparently showed on her face. You're thinking too hard about it, Gideon said, watching her crouch at the fireplace with an arrangement of logs that was technically correct but somehow stilted. It's not a puzzle. It's a fire. It wants to burn. You just stop getting in the way of that. That's not particularly helpful instruction. Here. He crouched beside her. He moved carefully, giving her space, she noticed, and repositioned one log with a single adjustment. The fire immediately breathed better. You were blocking the draw. She looked at the improved fire and felt the particular frustration of understanding something only after you've been shown it. How long did it take you to learn this? To make a fire? 2 weeks in the mountains and no other choice. You didn't grow up here? I was quiet for a moment. Grew up in Missouri. Came west at 19. She waited, in case there was more. There wasn't, not yet. She let it sit. On the second day, the storm began to ease in the afternoon. The wind dropped, the snow thinned, and by evening a hard, cold clarity had replaced the whiteout. Stars were visible through the window for the first time. Gideon went out for an hour and came back with a brace of grouse, which he cleaned and cooked with an efficiency she watched with open curiosity, cataloging each step without entirely meaning to. You're going to ask me about the killings, he said, while he was working. She had been thinking about it. She hadn't been planning to ask tonight. I was considering it. Go ahead. What happened in Pueblo? He didn't look up from what he was doing. His hands were steady. Mining company brought in men to break a labor action. Not deputies, not law, private enforcers, hired specifically to be brutal enough that workers stopped organizing. He paused. They were working their way through a settlement near the mine site, families. I was there. And you stopped them. 3 of them. 2 walked away. He looked up at her then, directly. The company had friends in the marshal's office. Easier to call it murder than to investigate who the dead men were and why they were in that settlement. Evelyn held his gaze. And you ran. Staying meant a trial in a county owned by the mining company. A pause. So yes, I ran. You've been up here since. Better than a rope. She nodded slowly. It was not a comfortable story. It was not supposed to be. What it was coherent, internally consistent, the way true things tended to be, with the specific texture of something lived rather than constructed. She had spent 11 months being lied to by a man with a very polished surface and had learned, in that time, to pay attention to texture. "I believe you," she said. He looked at her with something complicated moving behind his eyes. "Most people don't." "Most people didn't talk to you," she said. "They talked about you." A silence. The fire popped. Outside, somewhere distant, something moved in the dark trees. The sound carried clearly in the cold, still air after the storm. Gideon turned back to the cooking, and she thought she saw, in the set of his shoulders, some small thing relax that had been held tight. They ate by firelight with the storm fully past, and the mountains pressing in quiet and enormous all around the small, warm space of the cabin, and Evelyn thought about Philadelphia. The 40-room house, the crystal chandeliers, the cold smiles, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not happiness. Nothing as clean or simple as that. But the particular relief of being somewhere real. She was still in danger. She was still 1,200 miles from home, with no money and no proof, and a powerful man trying to have her killed. None of that had changed. But she was alive and fed and sitting across a fire from someone who had not lied to her once. And there was a version of the situation in which that was enough to build something on. She looked at Gideon across the fire. He was staring at the flames with that characteristic stillness of his, and she had no idea what he was thinking, which was strange. She was accustomed to reading people. She'd had to be. It was a survival skill as real in Philadelphia drawing rooms as it was on this mountain. But he was genuinely difficult to read, not because he was hiding things, but because what he felt was so quietly held that it didn't broadcast in the usual ways. "In the morning," he said, without looking up, "we go down. I know a back route that avoids the main pass. Should keep us clear of anyone watching the standard trail." "You're coming with me." I said we. "You don't have to." He looked up from the fire. "Yes, I do." She didn't ask him why. She thought she understood it, or was beginning to. Some things didn't need excavating. Some things were simply what they were, stated plainly, and you either accepted them or spent unnecessary energy arguing about them. "All right," she said. He went back to looking at the fire. She went back to looking at him. And the night settled around the cabin like something that had decided, for now at least, to leave them alone. The world outside the cabin was transformed. The storm had buried everything under 2 feet of fresh snow, and the mountains in the early morning silence had a quality that was almost violent in its beauty, the kind that reminded you it had nothing to do with you and never had. The cold was sharp enough to hurt on the inhale. Evelyn had borrowed a pair of Gideon's wool socks, thick as felt, and her feet were wrapped so thoroughly inside the oversized boots that she moved with a slight waddle she chose not to think about. Gideon had packed efficiently in the dark while she slept. She'd woken to find him already done, 2 packs by the door, the fire banked low. He'd handed her a coat without explanation, a heavy canvas and sheepskin thing that came down past her knees and smelled like wood smoke and something animal. It was warm in a way that her city coat had never managed to be. "That's too big," she'd said. "It's warm," he'd said, which settled that. The route he took down the mountain was nothing like the trail Garrett had used coming up. It was not, technically speaking, a trail at all. It was a series of decisions made through terrain, through pine forest. So dense the canopy blocked most of the snowfall and the ground underneath was navigable, across a frozen creek that held their weight with only a single alarming crack that Gideon ignored entirely, up and over a ridge that looked impassable until he found the seam in it and went through like he'd done it 100 times. Which, she gathered, he probably had. She followed 2 steps behind and paid attention. Not because she expected to need this route again, but because watching him move through this landscape was instructive in a way she couldn't fully articulate. There was a kind of knowledge in it that had nothing to do with books or education and everything to do with accumulated, embodied experience. He read the mountain the way she read a room full of people. The same constant low-level processing, the same rapid assessment, the same adjustment. She mentioned this, and he looked back at her with an expression of mild surprise, like the observation had come from an unexpected direction. "Never thought about it that way," he said. "How do you think about it?" "I don't. I just walk." They stopped mid-morning at a rocky outcropping where the tree line thinned enough to see down into the valley below. The town of Black Hollow was visible in the distance, tiny and gray against the white. smoke rising from a handful of chimneys. Beyond it, the road east, the road toward Denver, toward federal jurisdiction, toward the possibility of doing something with everything she remembered from those ledgers. Gideon crouched at the rock's edge and looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. She stood beside him and followed his sightline, but couldn't see what he was reading in the landscape. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders." He pointed. She squinted and eventually made out 3 dark shapes on the road below, moving with the purposeful pace of people who had somewhere specific to be. Coming from the Black Hollow direction, heading for the mountain approach. Harrow's men? Can't say for certain. He stood. But 3 riders in February coming toward the mountain the day after a storm breaks isn't a social call. She felt the cold in a different way now. Not the weather, but something running up her spine that had nothing to do with temperature. How long before they reached the trail? 2 hours. Maybe less. He was already adjusting the pack on his shoulders, his voice unhurried in a way that she was beginning to understand was not the absence of urgency, but the management of it. "We're not taking the main route down. There's a way through the north face that puts us below Black Hollow without passing through it." "Where does it come out?" "Mining Road, 3 miles east of town, runs to a relay station on the Denver line." He looked at her directly. "It's harder than what we just did." "How much harder?" A pause that told her everything before he answered. "Some climbing, on the outside of things. Cliffs. Ledges. There's a difference." "Is there?" "When you're on them, yes." He was already moving, taking a different angle through the trees, north and down. "Watch where I put my hands and feet. Do the same thing." She followed him and did not look down, which turned out to be the most useful decision she made all day. The North Face traverse took 3 hours and required her to do things she would not have believed she was capable of the week before, pressing herself flat against frozen rock while her fingers found holds and cracks. She had to trust before she could feel, moving sideways across a ledge that was wide enough for her feet but only barely, keeping her breathing even while her mind screamed at her about the drop below. Gideon moved ahead of her and talked her through each section without urgency, specific and plain. Left hand, that crack at eye level. Step across, don't step down. Wait on your back foot until you feel the next hold. She slipped once. Her right foot went out, and for one terrible second she was hanging by her hands from a rock face in the Colorado mountains, and the valley was a very long way below her. Gideon's hand caught her belt before she'd registered he'd moved. "I have you," he said. His grip was absolute. She found her footing, pressed herself back against the rock, and breathed. "Don't let go," she said, which was not her most articulate moment. "I'm not." He waited until she had both feet solid before he released her. "You're all right. 10 more feet and the ledge widens." "You could have mentioned the slippery section." "All the sections are slippery. If I mentioned all of them, we'd still be at the top." She laughed. The laugh came out slightly wrong. Too high, too quick, the laughter of someone whose body needed to release something. But it was real, and it surprised them both, and she heard something in his breath that might have been a sound of amusement before he turned back to the rock. The ledge widened. The climb eased. By early afternoon, they were on flat ground in a pine valley below the north face, and the mountain was behind them, and Evelyn's legs were shaking with a fine, continuous tremor she had to consciously ignore in order to keep walking. Gideon noticed. He didn't comment on the shaking, but he slowed his pace without making anything of it. They reached the mining road as the light began to go flat and gray, the short February afternoon already dimming toward evening. The road was unpaved and rutted and showed no recent tracks, which Gideon examined carefully before he let them step onto it. "We walked the road to the relay station," he said. "There'll be horses there, or at least shelter. Then we send a wire to Denver." "To who?" "If Harrow has people in the marshal's office, not the marshal's office." He started walking. "There's a federal judge in Denver named Nathaniel Graves. He's been trying to build a case against the Railroad Trust for 3 years. Hasn't had the evidence. Isn't owned by anyone that I know of, which is rarer than it sounds out here." Evelyn fell into step beside him. The road was easier than the mountain, but her body was compiling its objections regardless. "You know a federal judge?" "Know of him. Same way I knew of Harrow." A pause. "I've been watching what the railroads do to these territories for years. Graves is the one name I keep hearing from people who aren't crooked. That's not a particularly high bar." "No," he agreed, "but it's a bar." They walked in silence for a while. The evening settled in around them, and the cold deepened, and the pine trees on either side of the road stood dark and close. She was thinking about the relay station, about what she would write in a telegram to a federal judge she'd never met, about how to compress everything she'd read in those ledgers into something that would make a careful man take action instead of pause. She was also thinking about something else, something she'd been not thinking about since the mountain face, since his hand on her belt, and I have you said, with absolute calm conviction. And she made the decision to set it aside because there were more pressing matters, and she was not a person who confused gratitude with something more complicated, or she was trying not to be. "Tell me about Graves," she said. "What do you know?" What he knew was not extensive, but it was specific. Graves had presided over 2 federal fraud cases against mining companies in the past 5 years, both resulting in convictions that had been appealed repeatedly by well-funded legal teams. He had a reputation for being immovable under pressure and difficult to flatter. He had survived one apparent attempt to remove him from the bench through manufactured scandal, which had failed because the scandal had been too obviously manufactured. "He sounds like a man with enemies," Evelyn said. "Best kind, in his position." The relay station came into view around a bend in the road as full dark descended, a low building with light in the windows and a hitching post out front where 2 horses stood, heads down, patient. Smoke from the chimney. The faint sound of voices inside. Gideon stopped her with a hand on her arm before they reached the door. "Let me go first," he said. Not a question. "Because of your face, or because of mine?" "Both." He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a dry humor she was only now starting to detect in him. "Your face is currently on wanted notices. Mine is currently attached to a man most people in this territory would prefer not to antagonize unnecessarily. And you think that's preferable?" "I think it's what we have." He went in first. She waited in the cold and the dark and listened to the muffled voices inside go through a brief, tense adjustment. She couldn't hear the words, only the tones, and the tones went from wary to cautious to something that wasn't exactly comfortable but was functional. And then Gideon opened the door and held it. Inside, a heavy-set man behind a counter who had the look of someone who'd decided some time ago that minding his own business was the only way to survive the frontier, and a younger relay rider eating beans at a table who looked at Evelyn with wide eyes, and then very deliberately looked at the ceiling instead. "Telegram," Gideon said to the man behind the counter. "To Denver." The man put paper on the counter without comment. Evelyn stood at the counter in a coat that came down past her knees and wrote the telegram herself. She wrote it carefully, in the compressed, precise language of legal communication that her father had inadvertently trained her to use. Specific names, specific amounts, specific dates she could still see clearly when she closed her eyes. The manifest numbers from the first ledger. 3 of the names from the financial record. The key phrase from the correspondence log that she was fairly certain constituted direct evidence of conspiracy. She ended it with her name and where she was. She pushed the paper across the counter. The heavy-set man read it once. His face didn't change, but his jaw tightened incrementally. He looked up at Gideon, then back at Evelyn. "This goes to Judge Graves," she said. "Tonight. Wires don't guarantee—" "Tonight," she repeated, with the particular tone she had watched her father use his entire life on people he needed to move. Not threatening, not loud, but completely, absolutely certain. The tone of someone who expected to be obeyed because doubt was simply not part of their vocabulary. It worked. It had always worked when her father used it. She found, standing in this relay station at the edge of the Colorado mountains with blistered feet and borrowed clothes, that it worked for her too. The man took the paper without further comment and moved to the telegraph equipment. Gideon stood beside her and said nothing. But she felt, in the way that you feel someone's attention without seeing it, that he was looking at her. "What?" she said quietly. "Nothing." A pause. "You changed when you wrote that." "Changed how?" He seemed to consider the question with genuine seriousness. "Like you remembered who you were." She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. The telegraph clicked. The operator sent. They waited in the relay station while the young rider at the table finished his beans, and the horses shifted outside and the night deepened around the building. The reply came 40 minutes later. The operator read it, looked up, and slid the paper across the counter. It was from a clerk in Judge Graves' office, and it was 4 lines long, and it said that the judge had received her communication, that federal warrants were being prepared, that she should proceed to Denver and present herself at the federal courthouse on Larimer Street, and that she should bring whatever additional evidence she possessed. She read it 3 times. The handwriting on the telegram paper was smudged and slightly crooked from the printing mechanism, and it was the most important document she had held in her hands since the night she'd picked up her father's ledgers. She folded it carefully and put it inside the coat. Gideon was watching her when she looked up. In the low light of the relay station, with the fire behind him and the darkness pressing against the windows, he looked like exactly what the frontier had made of him, scarred and quiet and entirely genuine, which was rarer than any of the other things people said about him. "Denver," she said. "Denver," he agreed. But before either of them could say anything further, the door of the relay station opened, not with the ordinary noise of someone arriving out of the cold. It opened the way doors opened when the person on the other side was not particularly interested in courtesy, fast and hard, rebounding off the wall. 3 men came in out of the night. The one in front was tall and spare with a long coat and the flat professional eyes of a man who did not experience situations as personal. He looked at Evelyn with the brief, assessing glance of someone confirming an identification, then at Gideon with slightly more attention. "Evelyn Crow," he said. "I'm Silas Boone. I've been hired to return you safely to your family." Nobody in the room believed the word safely. Gideon had not moved. He was standing exactly where he'd been standing, one hand resting loosely on the counter, and he looked at Silas Boone with the expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said. His voice was completely even. Boone looked at him with the mild curiosity of someone who finds an obstacle mildly interesting. "Gideon Vale." He said the name like he was checking it off a list. "There's paper on you in 3 counties. I'd think carefully about how this goes." "I think carefully about most things." One of the men behind Boone shifted his weight. The young relay rider at the table had stopped existing as far as he was able to, his entire body arranged in the posture of someone hoping to become furniture. The operator behind the counter had taken 2 careful steps sideways, away from the telegraph equipment, away from everyone. Evelyn looked at the 3 men in the doorway and then at Gideon beside her and understood with absolute clarity that the next few seconds were going to determine everything. Boone's hand moved toward his coat. Gideon moved first, not toward Boone, but sideways, taking the oil lamp off the counter and hurling it against the wall beside the door in one fluid motion. The glass shattered, the flame caught the dry wood of the wall, and in the sudden roar of light and the shouts of startled men, Gideon grabbed Evelyn's arm, and they went out the back of the relay station through a door she hadn't even registered existed. Cold air, dark, running. Behind them, she could hear shouting, the crash of something knocked over, and then, with a sound that punched through the night air and hit her somewhere below the sternum, the crack of a gunshot. They ran into the dark Colorado night, and the mountains watched from every direction, vast and indifferent, as the woman who knew too much, and the man the world had decided to forget, ran hard along the frozen mining road with Silas Boone and 2 armed men somewhere close behind them. The telegram was in her coat. The judge knew her name, and there was no more time for anything except what came next. They ran for 10 minutes before Gideon pulled her off the road. Not a suggestion. His hand closed around her arm, and he simply changed their direction, taking them sideways into the tree line without breaking stride. And she went because every working part of her brain understood that he knew this terrain, and she did not, and this was not the moment for independent judgment. The snow in the pines was shallower than on the open road, the ground underneath more navigable, and the darkness under the canopy was total enough that she had to trust her feet entirely and concentrate on the sound of him moving ahead of her. Behind them, she could hear voices. Not close, but not far enough. Boone's men had horses. She'd seen them at the hitching post, 2 of them, and that was a problem with no good solution on open ground. In the trees, horses were less useful. In the trees, what mattered was knowing where you were going. Gideon stopped without warning, and she walked into his back. "Sorry," she whispered. He said nothing. He was listening. She made herself be still and listen too, and after a moment she could parse the sounds. The horses, further away now, moving along the road. The voices, 2 of them, calling back and forth. Not panicked. Methodical. Boone was a professional, and he was conducting a professional search. And professionals didn't thrash around in the dark wasting energy. They were covering the road and the obvious exits and waiting for their quarry to surface somewhere. "He'll have someone watching the relay station," Gideon said, very low. "Case we double back." "Can we?" "No." He turned in the dark, and she felt more than saw him orienting himself. There's a logging camp 2 miles north, abandoned last winter. If Boone's men don't know this range, they won't know about it. And if they do? A pause. Then we have a different problem. They moved north through the trees. The cold was severe now, the kind that stopped being a sensation and became a condition. Her body was simply cold, functioning within it rather than reacting to it, which she recognized dimly as either acclimatization or the early stage of something concerning. She kept moving. Moving was the solution to most of the things that could kill her tonight. She thought about the telegram in her coat. Graves knew her name. Graves had warrants being prepared. That was real, that existed, that could not be taken back. Unless Boone got to her before she reached Denver, in which case it didn't matter what any federal judge knew, because she would simply disappear, and her father would provide documentation explaining what had happened to her, and the story would be whatever story he chose to tell. She had no intention of letting that happen. The logging camp materialized out of the dark as a set of shapes. Two low structures, a collapsed equipment shed, the skeletal remains of a lumber stacking frame. No light, no smoke, no sign of recent occupation. Gideon circled it once at a distance before he let them approach, moving through the tree line with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that haste and survival were not the same thing. The main structure was intact enough. A low bunkhouse, the door hanging open, the interior smelling of cold and old wood, and something rodent-related she decided not to examine. Gideon pulled the door shut behind them and stood in the dark for a moment. "We stay until I'm sure they've moved past this section of the range," he said. "Could be 2 hours. Could be more. And then? There's another route to the Denver road, longer, adds half a day." He paused. "Can you manage that?" The question was genuine. He was actually asking, not testing. She registered that. "Yes," she said, and meant it, though her legs had opinions about it she was choosing to ignore. She heard him moving in the dark, heard the scrape of something, wood, furniture. A moment later the sound of a fire being built, and then the small orange mercy of flame catching tinder, and the bunkhouse came dimly into visibility. He'd found an old tin stove in the corner, partially functional, and he was feeding it carefully with wood from a dry pile someone had left stacked against the wall. The light was dim, and the warmth was going to take a while, but both were better than nothing, and nothing was what they'd had 30 seconds ago. Evelyn sat on a low bunk and watched him work and thought about Silas Boone. "He's not just a hired man," she said. "Boone. He knew your name. He would. I'm on paper in 3 counties, like he said." He said it like he'd done research, not like he'd heard a name. She was working through it the way her father had trained her. The particular mental habit of arranging information until the shape of it told you something. Harrow would have wanted someone who could handle both problems, finding me and dealing with whatever was between him and finding me. Gideon looked at her from across the small orange light of the stove. "He'd been briefed on me specifically." "Yes." "Which means Harrow knew you'd survived the mountain, knew you'd been found. Or suspected." She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. "Either way, Boone was looking for both of us. Not just me." Gideon was quiet for a moment, feeding another piece of wood into the stove. "Garrett talked." "Almost certainly." He absorbed this without visible reaction, but she saw something settle in his jaw, a tightening that passed quickly. Not fear. She had not yet seen anything that looked like fear from him, which she found simultaneously reassuring and faintly unnerving. What it was, she thought, was calculation. The specific calculation of a man revising his assessment of how much danger they were actually in. "Then Boone knows the cabin," he said. "Yes." "Can't go back there." "No." He looked at the fire. "All right." The words had the quality of a door closing on one thing and opening onto the next. No mourning it, no resisting it, just the plain acknowledgement of changed conditions and the adjustment required. "Denver is the only direction." She nodded. Then, because she had been thinking about it for 2 hours, and the low firelight, and the cold and the closeness of actual danger made something in her less inclined to manage what she said. "I'm sorry about the cabin." He looked at her. "Don't be. It's your home. It's a place I've been." A pause, and then more quietly, "Wasn't going to stay there forever." She didn't press it. Some things were said not to be examined, but simply to be heard, and she understood that about him now. That the things he said quietly and without elaboration were often the things that cost him something to say at all. They sat in the abandoned bunkhouse with the small fire between them and waited out the dark. At some point she slept, which she hadn't intended to do. She surfaced from it suddenly, disoriented, to find the fire still going and the quality of dark through the bunkhouse's one cracked window shifted slightly toward the blue-gray of early morning. Gideon was sitting against the wall near the stove, awake, and he had clearly been awake the entire time. "You should have slept," she said. "Someone needed to listen." She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Did you hear anything?" "Horses on the road about an hour ago, heading east." He stood, rolling his shoulders with the careful movement of someone working out the stiffness of a long, still night. "They're not gone, but they're not on top of us." They left the camp in the first pale light. The route Gideon took moved steadily east and south, angling away from the main Denver road and toward a secondary track he described as a freight route used by the mining operations before the Black Hollow mine flooded out. Less traveled, less obvious, longer. But by mid-morning, they reached a junction she recognized from the map in her head as putting them within 15 miles of the Denver outskirts. The freight road was navigable, and they made better time than the mountain terrain had allowed. She was tired in a way that had gone past the point of feeling like tiredness and settled into something more like a permanent condition of her body, the kind of exhaustion you stopped fighting and simply carried. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders hurt from the pack she'd been carrying since the cabin. The cold had become so ambient she'd stopped registering it as a specific sensation. Gideon handed her dried meat from his pack at noon without stopping walking, and she ate it while she walked, which was something she would not have been capable of imagining 2 weeks ago and which she now did without thinking. "Tell me what you plan to say to Graves," he said. She had been organizing it in her head for 2 days. She laid it out now in sequence. The shipping manifests first, because those were the most concrete and the most verifiable. The specific crate numbers and destination codes that federal investigators could cross-reference against legitimate railroad manifests. Then the financial ledger, the names and amounts, the pattern of payments that established the relationship between Harrow's operation and the men who'd been bought. Then the correspondence log, the coded language, the phrases she could tie to specific incidents she'd read about in newspapers. "I don't have the physical documents," she said. "Garrett took them." "Your testimony has the specifics a physical document would have. More, actually, you can contextualize what you read. A page of numbers is evidence. You explaining what those numbers mean is a case. A defense attorney would argue I invented or misremembered. Graves will have investigators. Once they start pulling on the threads you give them, they'll find the physical evidence. The manifest won't only exist in your father's study. There'll be copies at the railroad depots, the territorial outposts." He paused. "The men Harrow paid don't trust each other. Once they know the federal government is looking, some of them will cooperate." She looked at him. "You've thought about this." "Been thinking about it since you told me what was in the ledgers." He said it without self-consciousness. "These are the territories those weapons came to, the people they were used on. Some of them, I knew." The sentence landed quietly, without drama, and was more affecting for it. She thought about what he'd told her about Pueblo, about the settlement near the mine, about the specific shape of the injustice that had driven him into the mountains. And she thought about the weapons in those ledgers, the scale of it, the hundreds of crates moving through Harrow's network. How many Pueblos? How many settlements? How many families displaced or worse? "I'm going to make sure they hear every name I can remember," she said. "I know." He said it simply, the way he said things he meant without ceremony. Denver appeared in the late afternoon. They came down out of the foothills onto flat ground, and suddenly the city was there, smokestacks, spires, the grid of streets, the noise and smell of a real city rising to meet them after days of only wind and pine and cold silence. It felt aggressive, almost the density of it, the people and the horses, and the commerce, and the noise. She had been a city person her entire life, and the city now felt like something she needed to relearn. Gideon had gone quiet as they approached. She noticed this. "When did you last come to Denver?" she asked. 3 years ago, briefly." "You don't like it?" "I don't trust it." A pause. "Cities are where the money lives. Money and law are too close together out here." She understood what he was not saying. That a wanted man walking into a city was a different calculation than a wanted man in the mountains, where he knew every exit and every shadow. Here, the exits belonged to other people. Graves Courthouse is on Larimer Street, she said. I know where that is. Stay off the main avenues. There'll be people watching for us. Boone will have wired ahead if he has contacts in Denver, and a man like Harrow almost certainly has people watching the federal buildings. Then we can't go straight to the courthouse. Not in daylight. He looked at the city spread before them. There's a woman in the Auraria district who I helped years ago. Clara Bowman. Runs a boarding house. She won't ask questions. You're sure? Sure enough. He glanced at her. It's the best we have. She accepted that with the ease of someone who had stopped requiring certainty as a precondition for action. Best available was enough. Best available had been enough for days now. Clara Bowman was a small, direct woman, somewhere in her 50s, who opened her door, looked at Gideon for 2 seconds, and said, Lord, I thought you were dead. Then she looked at Evelyn and at the state both of them were in, and opened the door wider without asking anything else. The room she gave them was clean and had a real bed and a wash basin with actual warm water, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed after she'd washed her face and hands, and felt the accumulated weight of the past weeks pressing down on her all at once. The Philadelphia house, the train, the blizzard, the mountain face, the relay station, Boone's flat professional eyes in the doorway, all of it arriving simultaneously now that there was a moment of actual stillness to arrive into. She didn't cry. She had thought at various points that she would eventually cry, and she kept finding that she didn't. There was something in her that had decided crying was a thing for after, and after had not yet come. She heard Gideon's voice in the next room, talking low with Clara. She heard Clara's voice in reply, practical and quiet, asking questions and receiving answers. She took the telegram from inside the coat and smoothed it flat on her knee. Present yourself at the federal courthouse on Larimer Street. Bring whatever additional evidence you possess. She was here. She was alive. She had names and amounts and dates stored in a memory her father had spent 20 years sharpening for his own purposes, and tomorrow she was going to walk into that courthouse and use every single one of them. Gideon knocked on the door frame. Clara's getting food. You should eat. I will. She looked at him in the doorway. Tomorrow morning. The courthouse. Tomorrow morning. He held her gaze. Whatever happens in there, you know what you saw. Don't let anyone talk you out of what you know. She thought about the study. The 3 ledgers spread on her father's desk. The specific, careful handwriting in the correspondence log. The weight of the things she had understood in that room, the clarity of it even while every other part of her was afraid. Nobody will, she said. And she meant it the way she had never meant anything her father had tried to teach her. Not because she had been told to, not because it was expected, but because it was simply the truth of who she had, somewhere between Philadelphia and here, become. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't surprising. The bed was the softest surface she had occupied in weeks, and her body, instead of surrendering to it gratefully, spent most of the night in a kind of low-level vigilance that she couldn't switch off. Every creak of the boarding house, every horse passing on the street below, every shift in the wind against the window glass registering as a potential threat before her half-conscious mind caught up and identified it as ordinary. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and ran through names and numbers like a rosary. Manifest numbers, payment amounts, dates, the specific wording of 3 passages from the correspondence log that she had decided were the most legally significant. By 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and sat at the small writing desk near the window with a candle Clara had left and wrote everything down on paper, not in the compressed telegram language of the night before, but fully, in sequence, organized the way her father had taught her to organize a financial presentation. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, filling both sides of 4 sheets, her hand cramping halfway through and continuing anyway. When the gray light of early morning began coming through the window, she read it back twice, made 3 corrections, and folded the papers into the inside pocket of the coat alongside the telegram. She heard Gideon moving in the next room. Then quiet. Then a knock. "I'm awake," she said. He opened the door and looked at her at the desk with the candle burned nearly down and the pen still in her hand and said nothing for a moment. "You wrote it out," he said. "Everything I remember, all of it." She set the pen down. "If something happens to me before I reach Graves, you take those papers to the courthouse yourself." He looked at her with an expression she had learned over the past days to read as disagreement he was deciding whether to voice. He voiced it. "Nothing's going to happen to you." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. But I'm operating on the assumption. Operate on both assumptions. Take the papers if you need to. A long pause. All right. Clara fed them before dawn. Eggs and salt pork and coffee that was real coffee, not the boiled grain approximation she'd been drinking in Black Hollow. And Evelyn drank 2 cups and felt something in her nervous system settle incrementally. Clara moved around her kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people in difficult circumstances for a long time and had stopped requiring explanation for any of it. The Larimer Street Courthouse, Clara said, without preamble, while she was clearing plates. There's a back entrance on the alley side. The federal marshal's office uses it for witness transfers, less visible than the front. Evelyn looked up. How do you know that? Because I've lived in this city for 20 years and I pay attention. She gave Evelyn a look that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. There were 2 men watching the front of this building last night, sitting in a carriage on the opposite side of the street. They were there when I closed up at 10 and gone by 2 in the morning. Gideon set his coffee cup down. Boone moved faster than I expected. He had horses, Evelyn said. We were on foot. The alley entrance, Clara continued, addressing them both with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has already made the relevant decisions and is simply conveying them. I can take you in the supply wagon. I do a delivery run to a restaurant on Market Street every Tuesday morning. Today is Tuesday. 2 people in the back under canvas isn't remarkable. Evelyn looked at this woman she had met 8 hours ago and felt something she couldn't articulate, a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with prior acquaintance. Some people were just plainly, stubbornly on the right side of things, not because of ideology or drama, but because it was simply the kind of people they were. It was rarer than it should have been. Thank you, she said. Clara waved a hand. Don't make it sentimental. Eat the rest of those eggs. They left at 6:30 in the gray Denver morning, Evelyn and Gideon lying flat in the bed of Clara's supply wagon under a canvas that smelled of flour and coffee beans, the wagon moving through the waking city at the unhurried pace of commercial routine. She could hear the city around her. The street noise, the horses, the voices of people beginning their Tuesday, and she lay still and breathed and held the folded papers against her chest through the fabric of the coat. Gideon was 6 inches away. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air under the canvas. If this works, she said very quietly, what do you do? He was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? After. If Graves acts on, if the warrants go through. You're still on paper in 3 counties. That's a problem for after. I'm asking about after. She felt him shift slightly. Outside, the wagon turned a corner and the city noise changed character. Fewer horses, narrower street, getting close. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest answer he could have given, and she recognized it as such. Haven't thought past Denver. I have, she said, then stopped, because the wagon was slowing, and after was going to have to wait for the immediate problem of now. The wagon stopped, Clara's voice above them. Market Street delivery, quick as you can. They came out from under the canvas in a narrow alley behind a row of commercial buildings, the cobblestones slick with morning frost and a thin snow beginning to fall. Clara pointed without speaking. The alley ran east, and at the far end, maybe 80 yards away, she could see the rear of a large stone building with a plain wooden door and a gas lamp burning beside it. Gideon looked at the alley, both directions, with the systematic scan she had watched him apply to every space he entered. Clear, he said. They moved quickly. The snow was coming down harder now, small dry flakes that the wind pushed sideways, and Evelyn pulled the oversized coat tighter and walked fast and kept her eyes on the door at the end of the alley, and told herself that Boone's men were watching the front entrance, and that Clara's information was good, and that the next 5 minutes were simply a matter of covering 80 yards of cobblestone. They were 40 yards from the door when a figure stepped out of the alcove on the right side of the alley. Then another, from the left. And then, from the far end, blocking the door itself, Silas Boone. I was alone at the door. The 2 men behind them were the flanking move, cutting off the retreat. 3 total. Boone had positioned them well. He'd had all night to work out the approach vectors, and he'd used the time correctly, which said something about him that she wished she could afford to find professionally admirable. He looked at them across the 40 yards of snowy alley with the expression of a man who has been doing this long enough that he doesn't feel the need to perform anything about it. Last chance to do this quietly, he said. His voice carried clearly in the alley. Miss Crow, your family is worried about you. Come with me and no one gets hurt. My family tried to kill me twice, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. I'm going to have to decline. Boone looked at Gideon. Vale, this isn't your business. Walk away and I won't pursue the outstanding warrants. Generous, Gideon said. How was positioning himself, she noticed. Not in front of her, but beside her and slightly angled, putting himself between her and Boone while keeping the two men behind them in his peripheral line of sight. No. The two men behind them moved forward. What happened next was not elegant, and it was not brief, and it was nothing like the composed action sequences she had read about in the frontier adventure novels that Philadelphia ladies kept in their nightstands. It was chaotic and loud and happened faster than her conscious mind could track. Gideon went toward the two men behind them, rather than away from them, which was so counterintuitive that it took the men a second to process it. A second in which he closed the distance and hit the nearer man with the kind of force that did not suggest restraint. The man went down hard. The second man got hold of Gideon's coat, and they went sideways into the alley wall together, struggling, the impact loud in the narrow space. Evelyn ran, not away, toward Boone. She ran because the door was behind him, and the door was what mattered, and she had 4 sheets of paper in her coat and a federal judge 30 feet on the other side of that door, and she had not survived Philadelphia, and a blizzard, and a mountain face, and 3 weeks of being hunted through the Colorado wilderness to stop 40 yards short of the only finish line that existed. Boone reached for his weapon. She reached him before he cleared the holster. Not because she was faster, she was absolutely not faster, but because he'd expected her to stop and she hadn't, and she hit him with her shoulder at full momentum, which was not enough to knock him down, but was enough to knock his draw arm sideways and send the pistol scraping against the doorframe instead of coming level. He grabbed her by the coat. She twisted, shrugged out of the oversized coat entirely. It was 2 sizes too big, and she was out of it in 1 second, and lunged for the door handle. Behind her, she heard the pistol hit the cobblestones. She hit the door with both hands. It was unlocked. It opened. She fell through it into a narrow corridor with gas lamps on the wall, and a startled young man in a clerk's jacket who dropped the folders he was carrying and stared at her. In her borrowed clothes, her hair coming completely undone, wild-eyed and breathing hard, as though she had materialized from somewhere outside the normal boundaries of his Tuesday. Judge Graves, she said. I need to see Judge Nathaniel Graves, right now. Ma'am, you can't just... My name is Evelyn Crow. I sent a telegram 2 days ago. He's expecting me. She heard noise in the alley behind her. She did not turn around. She needed this clerk's eyes, and she needed him to make one decision in the next 5 seconds. The men in the alley behind me were hired by Lucian Harrow to prevent me from reaching this building. I need you to lock that door and take me to Judge Graves. The clerk looked at her. He was perhaps 22 years old, and he had the look of someone who had taken a government job because it seemed stable and orderly and was now confronting evidence that it was neither. Then he locked the door. This way, he said. She followed him down the corridor, up a flight of stairs, through a heavy oak door into a wider hallway that smelled of polished wood and paper, and the particular close atmosphere of institutional authority. She was aware of how she looked, aware of it in the specific way of someone who has spent her entire life in rooms where appearance was a form of power, and who understood that walking into a federal judge's chambers looking like she'd been living in the mountains for 3 weeks was not ideal. She also understood that it was going to have to be sufficient. The clerk knocked on a door at the end of the hall. A voice from inside said, "Come in." The clerk opened the door and looked back at her with an expression she would remember for a long time. Not the blank compliance of someone just following procedure, but the look of a young man who had made a small, genuine choice and was not sure what it would cost him. She nodded at him. He nodded back. She went in. Judge Nathaniel Graves was 60-something, broad across the shoulders, in a way that age had softened, but not eliminated, with a gray beard kept short and the kind of eyes that processed information quickly and without visible emotional leakage. His desk was covered in documents, and he was reading one when she entered, and he looked up and looked at her for a long 3 seconds before he spoke. "Miss Crow," he said. "Judge Graves." She crossed to his desk and placed the 4 sheets of paper directly in front of him. "I don't have the physical ledgers. They were taken. But I have everything I read in them, written out in sequence with specific figures, names, dates, and manifest codes that your investigators can cross-reference against the railroad's official records." She paused. "And I have approximately 40 minutes before the man Lucian Harrow hired to stop me reaching this building regroups and tries another approach." Graves looked at the papers. He did not reach for them yet. He looked at her. You understand, he said carefully, that your father has filed legal documentation with the Pennsylvania courts declaring you mentally incompetent. Yes, I understand. She met his eyes. I also understand that my father filed those documents within 18 hours of me showing him evidence that he was running a weapons smuggling network through Harrow's Railroad. The timing is not coincidental. The documentation is designed to make anything I say legally dismissible. A pause. Which is why everything on those pages is specific enough to be verified independently without relying on my testimony alone. Graves looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up the papers and began to read. She stood in front of his desk and watched him read and kept her breathing even and did not speak. The clock on his wall ticked. Outside the window, Denver went about its morning. The snow was still falling. She could see it past his shoulder, small and steady. He read all 4 pages. He turned back to the first page and read 2 sections again. Then he set them down and looked at her. The manifest codes, he said. If these match against the official railroad records, they will. I copied them exactly. I have a precise memory for figures. My father spent 20 years making sure of it. A pause. He didn't consider the possibility that I would use it against him. Graves was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who made consequential decisions regularly and had learned that the time spent on them before the moment of commitment was worth more than the time spent second-guessing after. The man in the alley, he said. Silas Boone. Yes, he's known to us. He's operated in this territory for 4 years under private contract. He reached for the bell on his desk. If he's outside this building, I want him taken into custody before he leaves the city. He rang the bell twice. The clerk appeared. Graves gave instructions in the brisk, specific language of a man accustomed to being clearly understood, and the clerk disappeared. Then Graves looked back at her. Sit down, Miss Crow. This is going to take some time. She sat. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of questions. Methodical, thorough, sometimes circling back to the same point from a different angle in the way of a man testing for inconsistency. She answered every question fully and directly, and where she was uncertain she said so, which she understood was more persuasive than false certainty would have been. Graves had a young associate named Holt, who took notes in shorthand and occasionally asked clarifying questions of his own, and 2 federal investigators who arrived in the second hour and began cross-referencing the manifest codes against railroad records they pulled from the territorial office 3 blocks away. At the 2-hour mark, one of the investigators came back into the room and placed a document on Graves' desk without saying anything. Graves read it. He looked at Evelyn. 3 of the manifest codes you provided match against flagged irregularities in the territorial railroad audit from last year, he said. The audit was closed without action. The commissioner who closed it is on your list. Yes, she said. He is. By the 3rd hour, the room had acquired additional people. A second investigator, a man from the federal attorney's office, and a marshal's deputy who stood by the door with the patient expression of someone waiting for instructions. The conversation had shifted from verification to logistics, from is this real to what do we do with the fact that it's real? And Evelyn sat in the middle of it and answered questions and watched the machinery of federal authority engage in a way she had never witnessed from this side of it. She thought about her father once, in the middle of the 3rd hour. Not with grief, exactly. She had done her grieving for the version of him she'd needed him to be sometime during the train ride west, in a Kansas City depot at 2 in the morning with $4 to her name. What she felt now was something flatter and more durable. Clarity, maybe. The particular freedom of a person who no longer needs someone to be other than what they are. She pushed it aside and answered the next question. At the 4th hour, Graves signed 3 sets of warrants, 1 for Lucian Harrow, 1 for Edmund Crow, 1 for 6 named associates, including the federal land commissioner and 2 of the men from the financial ledger whose names she had been most certain of. He signed them at his desk with the same unhurried deliberateness he had applied to everything else, and Evelyn sat across from him and watched the pen move and felt something she did not immediately have language for. Not triumph. Triumph was too lean, too self-congratulatory, for something that had cost this much and was going to continue to cost things she couldn't yet predict. It was more like the feeling of weight finally distributed correctly, not removed, but placed where it actually belonged. Miss Crow. Graves set down the pen and looked at her directly. The Pennsylvania incompetency filing will be challenged as part of this proceeding. Given the timing and the evident motivation, I expect it to be invalidated. Your inheritance should be restored by federal decree within 60 days. I understand. You'll need to remain in Denver for the immediate period. We'll need you available for the federal investigation. He paused. You'll be safe here. I'll have a marshal's deputy assigned to your lodging. She thought about Clara's boarding house, about the warm room and the real coffee, and nodded. There's one other matter, she said. Gideon Vale. Graves looked at her steadily. He found me dying in a blizzard and brought me in. He guided me down from the mountains and helped me reach this building this morning. Without him, I would not be sitting in front of you. She kept her voice level. The outstanding warrants against him in Pueblo County are based on a prosecution that was opened at the request of the Consolidated Mining Company and conducted in a county they financially controlled. I would like that reviewed. Graves was quiet for a moment. That's a separate matter from... I know it's a separate matter. I'm raising it separately. She held his gaze. I'm aware that I just gave you the most significant federal corruption case in this territory in 10 years. I am asking you, in exchange for that, to look at what was done to Gideon Vale and determine whether it was legal. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood each other clearly. I'll have someone look at the Pueblo record, Graves said. I make no promises about the outcome. I don't need promises, she said. I need it looked at by someone honest. He almost smiled. Not quite. Get some rest, Miss Crow. We'll need you back here tomorrow. She found Gideon in the corridor outside the federal marshal's office on the ground floor, sitting on a wooden bench with his forearms on his knees and a cut above his left eye that had bled down the side of his face and dried there. The second of Boone's men, she gathered. Both had been taken into custody. She'd been told this during the second hour of questioning. Boone himself had been apprehended attempting to stable his horses on the east side of the city, which she found grimly satisfying. Gideon looked up when she came out. He looked at her face and read it the way he read terrain, quickly, without asking. Warrants, she said. He let out a long breath. Harrow, my father, 6 others. She sat down on the bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Graves is sending federal investigators to Philadelphia tonight. They'll have Harrow in custody within the week. Gideon said nothing. He looked at the floor for a moment with the expression of a man absorbing something that required space. I raised the Pueblo matter with Graves, she said. He looked at her sharply. You didn't need to do that. Yes, I did. She met his eyes. He's going to have someone review the record. He made no promises. But it will be looked at by someone who isn't in the pocket of the mining companies. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The cut above his eye was going to need cleaning and probably a stitch, and he had the general appearance of a man who had recently been in a fight in a frozen alley, and he was looking at her with an expression that she recognized, finally, for what it was. Not calculation, not assessment, but something simpler and considerably more human than either. You didn't have to, he said again, quieter. I know. A pause. Outside the building, Denver continued its Tuesday. A cart went past on the street. Voices somewhere down the corridor, official and unhurried. The papers this morning, she said, when I ran for the door and left you with both of them. I noticed that. I needed to get through that door. I know you did. He said it without accusation. It was the right call. She had known he would say that. She had known it, and she still needed to hear it, which said something about her that she was willing to accept. I told Graves I need to stay in Denver for the investigation period, she said. 60 days, possibly more. A pause. He'll have someone look at Pueblo. If the record is as bad as you described, they may be able to move on clearing the warrants. Gideon looked at his hands. And after 60 days? I don't know yet. She said it honestly. My inheritance gets restored. Philadelphia is an option technically. The newspapers will want to talk to me. My family's lawyers will want to negotiate something. She paused. I have no interest in any of it. What do you have interest in? It was a direct question. He asked them. She had learned. He didn't circle around things when the direct version was available. She thought about this cabin on the mountain. Not the rifles on the wall or the wolf pelts on the floor. Those were surfaces. She thought about the fire. She thought about 2 days of genuine quiet, genuine conversation, genuine listening, in a space where no one was performing anything for anyone. She thought about what she had felt learning to read a fire properly, and navigating a mountain face, and understanding for the first time in her adult life that her own judgment could be trusted. She thought about sitting across from this man in the dark with the storm outside and thinking, this is somewhere real. I haven't decided yet, she said, but I know what I don't want. He nodded slowly. He understood the architecture of that sentence, what it contained and what it was leaving room for. There's work to do here, she said, after the investigation. Graves mentioned that the closure of the Pueblo audit was connected to a pattern. Other audits, other counties, other mining operations. If someone were going to pursue the full scope of what was done in these territories, she paused. It would take time, probably years. It would require someone who knows this territory, who knows the mining operations, who knows which of the official records are falsified and which aren't. Gideon was very still. I'm not asking you anything, she said. I'm describing a situation. You're describing a situation very specifically. I have a precise memory. I can't help how specifically I describe things. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had learned to read. The stillness that wasn't passivity, the careful consideration that wasn't hesitation. Then, very quietly, something shifted in it. Something that had been held became, fractionally, less held. The cabin's gone, he said. I know. I'd need somewhere to operate from, something more settled than I've been. That seems reasonable. Denver is a city. There are places outside Denver that aren't. She held his gaze. Clara mentioned the valley south of the city. Mining country. People who need someone to... I know the valley south of the city. I thought you might. Another long pause. Outside, the snow had stopped. The light coming through the corridor window had shifted to the flat white of a cleared winter afternoon. You nearly died 3 weeks ago, he said. In the snow, on my mountain. I did. And your plan is to stay in the wilderness. My plan is to be somewhere I can do something useful. Where that is specifically is a detail. She paused. I also don't freeze to death as easily as I used to. Namud, the sound she had first identified in the logging camp. The one that was almost a laugh. No, he said. You don't. She looked at the cut above his eye. That needs cleaning. I'm aware. Clara will have something. Probably. They sat for a moment longer in the corridor of the federal courthouse on Larimer Street, Denver, in the February cold of 1883, with warrants signed and cases opened and 60 days of required presence in the city ahead of them, and the particular open quality of a situation that had not yet determined its own shape. Then Evelyn Crow stood up, straightened the coat she'd put back on when the marshal's deputy had retrieved it from the alley, and looked at Gideon Vale on the bench. Come on, she said. Let's go find somewhere to eat. He stood. He was still, as always, considerably taller than she'd registered when she wasn't right next to him, and the cut above his eye was going to need attention, and he looked like exactly what he was. A man who had been living outside the boundaries of normal society for years, and who was, tentatively and with appropriate suspicion, considering the possibility of a different arrangement. They walked out of the federal building together into the thin winter light of Denver. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about dismantling an operation. The size of Heiress was simple, or fast, or clean. Graves investigators arrived in Philadelphia on a Thursday and arrested Lucian Harrow at his club in the middle of dinner, which several newspapers covered in enough detail that the account made it back to Denver by the following Monday. Edmund Crow was taken into custody 2 days later at the family estate, which was a different kind of news story, quieter, more carefully worded, with the particular delicacy that newspapers applied to the downfall of men who had previously been considered respectable. Evelyn read both accounts in Clara's kitchen over coffee and felt the same thing she'd felt watching Graves sign the warrants. Not triumph, not grief, but the flat, durable clarity of things being placed where they belonged. The Pennsylvania incompetency filing was invalidated within 3 weeks, faster than Graves had predicted, because the judge who reviewed it took one look at the timeline and called it what it was. The federal decree restoring her inheritance came through 6 weeks after that. She did not go back to Philadelphia to collect it in person. She sent a lawyer. The Pueblo County record took longer. Graves had assigned a careful young investigator named Marsh to review it, and Marsh was thorough in a way that was sometimes maddening and ultimately necessary. He spent 4 weeks pulling records, interviewing surviving witnesses, tracking the chain of decisions that had produced the warrant against Gideon. What he found was not surprising, but was, documented in full, substantially worse than the outline Gideon had provided. A prosecution built on false testimony from company men, a judge who had received payment from the mining company 6 months prior, and physical evidence that had been altered between collection and presentation. Marsh submitted his report to Graves in late March. The warrants against Gideon Vale were vacated on a Tuesday afternoon, which Evelyn considered quietly appropriate. She told Gideon that evening. They were at the small house they'd taken south of the city proper, in the foothills where the city thinned out and the mountains started to show themselves again above the tree line. Not a cabin, not by any means the elaborate establishment her Philadelphia life would have considered adequate, but a working place with good walls and a proper stove and a view that made you understand every morning exactly where you were in the world. I was outside when she came back from the courthouse, splitting firewood with the methodical efficiency she had come to recognize as his version of thinking, the physical task freeing whatever he needed to work through. She told him about Marsh's report and the vacated warrants, standing in the late afternoon light with her coat on and the cut of mountain air in her throat. He set the axe down. I didn't say anything for a moment. She let the silence be what it was, which was not emptiness but the kind of full quiet that only existed between people who had stopped needing to fill space with sound. Marsh did good work, he said finally. He did. Tell him I said so. I will. He picked the axe back up, then stopped, set it down again, and looked at her. Really looked at her. But the direct, unblinking attention she had first registered in a firelit cabin, and that still, months later, had the quality of being genuinely seen rather than observed. I owe you that, he said. You don't. I do. Not arguing, stating. You know you do. She held his gaze. Then we'll call it even for pulling me out of a blizzard. He almost smiled. Close enough. That's not an even trade. It is from where I'm standing. The spring came slowly to the foothills. Not the dramatic greening of eastern springs, but a gradual, grudging shift. The snow pulling back by inches, the ground emerging gray and then brown, and then, eventually, the first tentative color of things that had been waiting. Evelyn spent the mornings working with Marsh's team on the broader investigation, the pattern of falsified audits, the other counties, the other operations connected to Harrow's network. She had been right about the scope of it. It was years of work, and she was not going to leave it to other people to finish. In the afternoons, she was learning things. This was not a plan she had articulated. It had simply begun happening, the way things happened when you stopped managing every aspect of your existence and allowed for the occasional unscheduled development. Gideon had started teaching her to read terrain seriously, not as a survival necessity, but as a skill, how to navigate by landmark and sun and the behavior of water, how to judge weather by the character of the light and the movement of animals, how to move through the wilderness with the particular confidence of someone who understood it rather than feared it. She learned it the same way she had learned to build a fire, with concentrated, sometimes frustrated attention and the occasional small victory that landed with disproportionate satisfaction. In the evenings, she read. Sometimes he did too. The books had multiplied on the shelf beside the stove. She had brought her own from Denver, and they occupied a slightly strange variety of shelf space alongside his geological surveys and his battered Melville. They didn't talk about Philadelphia. There was nothing useful to say about Philadelphia. The lawyers handled Philadelphia. What mattered was here, and the work, and the next thing. What they did talk about, in the evenings by the stove, was everything else. The territory, the people in it, the families who had survived what Harrow's weapons had been used to do, and who were still here, still working their claims or their homesteads or whatever remained of what they'd built. The investigators who were doing their jobs with varying degrees of honesty and varying degrees of courage. The specific, complicated, imperfect business of trying to do something right in a place where the wrong thing had been standard practice for a long time. Gideon talked more in the evenings than he did during the day. She had learned this about him, that the darkness and the quiet and the fire brought something out of him that the functional daytime hours put away, not because he was hiding it, but because it needed a particular kind of space. He told her about Missouri in pieces, over weeks, a father who was methodical and decent, a mother who died when he was 12, the specific restlessness that had driven him west at 19 because staying felt like a slow disappearance. He told her about the years before Pueblo, before the mountains, when he had believed that the frontier offered something the East didn't. Not freedom exactly, but space, the possibility of a life that wasn't already determined. And then Pueblo, she said once, and then Pueblo. A pause. After that, the mountains were less of a choice. And now? He looked at the fire. Now they're still home. Just a bigger version of it than before. She understood him. That was the thing she returned to privately, when she wasn't examining it directly. That she understood him in the specific way you understood someone whose thinking moved like your own, but had arrived somewhere entirely different. He was not a mirror of her. He was not easy or uncomplicated or designed to make her comfortable. He disagreed with her regularly and did it directly, and was sometimes wrong and said so when he figured that out, which was not always quickly. But she understood him, and he understood her with the same lack of ceremony, not performing comprehension, not telling her he understood, just responding to what she actually said rather than to the more manageable version of it. That was not a small thing. She had spent 26 years in a world where almost no one had done that. By summer, 3 of the 6 men named in the warrants had been convicted. Harrow's trial was set for the fall, a federal proceeding that had attracted the kind of national attention that made the prosecuting attorneys nervous, and Evelyn calmly determined she would testify. She had known she would testify from the moment she wrote those 4 pages at Claire's writing desk in the gray Denver morning, and she had been preparing for it since with the same organized precision she had applied to everything else. Her father's case was more complicated. He had engaged lawyers who were spending extraordinary amounts of money on delay, and the delay was working, the way delay usually worked for wealthy men who could afford it. Graves was patient. Evelyn was patient. The record existed and was not going anywhere, and the men her father had paid were, one by one, finding it more advantageous to cooperate with federal investigators than to continue protecting someone who had demonstrated a complete willingness to sacrifice other people when it became necessary. She thought about him sometimes, in the way you thought about something unresolved, not obsessively, not with the heat of fresh betrayal, but with the cool, recurring attention you gave to a thing that still required accounting. He had made his choices. The choices had consequences. That was not complicated, even when it was painful, and the pain and the clarity were not mutually exclusive. The morning Harrow's trial began in October. Evelyn stood in front of the courthouse on Larimer Street and looked at the building and breathed the cold fall air and thought about a 3rd-floor bedroom in Philadelphia and a snow-covered garden and a stable hand who had given her $20 and a too large coat without asking any questions. She had never been able to find that man to thank him properly. She hoped he was all right. She hoped he knew, somehow, that it had mattered. Gideon was beside her. He was going to be called as a witness, too. Marsh had been thorough, and Gideon's knowledge of the territory and the operations within it was part of the prosecution's case. He had agreed to testify without particular emotion about it, in the same way he approached most things, as a necessary task, to be done fully and without drama. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the courthouse doors. Through them were Harrow's lawyers, and the packed gallery, and the journalists, and the federal judge, and the specific, difficult, necessary process of making a public record of a private crime. "Yes," she said. She meant it. She had been ready since a fire-lit cabin in February, since a mountain ledge with shaking hands, since the door of a relay station and a telegram folded against her chest. Ready was not the absence of fear or difficulty or the likelihood of things going wrong in ways she couldn't predict. Ready was just the decision to go through the door anyway. She went through the door. Some stories end with justice delivered clean and complete, the scales balanced and the score settled, the villain receiving exactly what they deserve in proportion to exactly what they did. That was not the kind of story this was. Harrow was convicted in November on 4 counts of federal conspiracy and 2 counts of fraud. He received 12 years and served 9 before a series of legal appeals reduced his sentence, which was neither surprising nor particularly satisfying, but was the outcome the system produced and was better than nothing, which was the available comparison. Edmund Crowe never went to trial. His lawyers kept the case in procedural limbo for 3 years, and then he died of a stroke in the winter of 1886, and the case died with him. Evelyn found out by telegram on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for a long time before she wrote back to the lawyer to handle the estate arrangements. She did not go back to Philadelphia for the burial. She was not sure, if she was honest with herself, how to grieve someone who had done what he had done while also being, in the early memories she could not entirely displace, her father. She did not resolve that question. Some questions didn't resolve, they just became less sharp with time. What endured was the work. The investigation that had started with 4 pages of her handwriting on Clara Bowman's writing desk expanded over the years into a multi-county federal inquiry that eventually resulted in the prosecution of 11 individuals and the dissolution of 2 corrupt territorial audit offices. It was slow, unglamorous, sometimes deeply frustrating labor that required sustained attention over long periods without the drama of clear victories. And Evelyn did it anyway because the people the weapons had been used against deserved the record, deserved the accounting, even when the accounting was imperfect and slow and arrived years after the harm. She was not a hero of the frontier, whatever the newspapers sometimes tried to say about her. She was a woman with a good memory and a useful skill set, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that the alternative to continuing was worse than continuing. That was enough. Gideon's warrants were formally expunged from the territorial record in the summer of 1884, in a brief legal proceeding that he attended without ceremony and that Evelyn attended beside him with a quiet satisfaction she did not especially perform for anyone. The Pueblo Mining Company had long since abandoned its Colorado operations, and the men who had run it were either dead or gone east to find new havens, and the legal erasure of the warrant was less significant in practical terms than in what it represented. That someone had looked honestly at what had been done and called it what it was. He continued to know the mountains better than anyone. He continued to guide people when they needed it, and to know which of the trails were passable in which seasons, and to read weather and terrain with the accumulated knowledge of a man who had lived in a place long enough to understand it. He also became, over time, one of the investigators' most reliable sources on the territorial operations, not in any official capacity, but in the practical way of someone who knew where to look and how to read what he found. They built the homestead in the foothills south of Denver over 2 years, not quickly and not without difficulty. There were walls that had to be taken down and rebuilt because the first approach hadn't accounted for the winter wind off the high peaks, and a roof that leaked in the first spring thaw and took 3 weekends to fix properly, and a kitchen stove that required more coaxing than any inanimate object should reasonably require. People found them, over time. Not because they advertised, they didn't, but because the territories had networks of their own, the word of mouth of people who needed something and were told of someone who might help. A widow with 3 children whose homestead claim was being challenged by a railroad company that wanted her land. A group of workers from a closed mine who had nowhere to go and no one willing to hire men who had organized. A handful of people who had been displaced by exactly the kind of violence that Harrow's weapons had enabled, and who were trying to build something in the aftermath. Evelyn helped where she could, with legal navigation, with the specific knowledge of how corrupt systems worked, and where their pressure points were. Gideon helped with the practical, shelter, food, the knowledge of how to survive in this particular country. Neither of them thought of it as charity or as mission. It was just what needed doing, and they were present, and they had the relevant skills. She turned 30 in the mountains with a fire going, and 2 people she had met 6 months prior sitting at the table, and she thought about the version of this birthday she had been heading toward before Philadelphia. A dinner party in a chandelier-lit room, people saying things that meant nothing to people who were listening to nothing, and herself in the middle of it wearing a dress she hadn't chosen and smiling at a man she knew was monstrous and had no way to refuse. She was not going to tell anyone that she was grateful for what her father had done in sending those men to her bedroom that February night. That was not where the gratitude lived. The gratitude lived in what she had discovered about herself in the process of surviving it. The specific, inarguable knowledge that she was capable of things she had never been permitted to find out about, that her judgment was sound, that she could trust herself, that a life with less comfort and less security and considerably more difficulty could also be a life that was entirely, genuinely hers. That was worth something. It was worth more than the 40-room house and the crystal chandeliers and the first-class ticket back east that she had never bought. And if you had to pay a specific price for it, she had paid that price and did not regret the transaction, most days. Gideon, one evening in the second winter, said to her across the fire, "You could have gone back, you know, after the trial, after the inheritance came through. You had options." "I know," she said. This wasn't the obvious choice. "No," she agreed. "So why?" She looked at the fire. She had thought about how to answer this kind of question and had never fully satisfied herself, because the real answer resisted the kind of language that made it sound sensible to people who hadn't been where she'd been. But Gideon was not people who hadn't been there, and so she tried. "Because I kept waiting to want to go back," she said. "In Denver, when the inheritance came through." when the newspapers were writing about me, when the lawyers from Philadelphia were sending letters. I kept waiting to feel the pull of it, the life I'd been raised for, the world I'd been trained to navigate. She paused. And it wasn't there. I'd thought it would be. I'd thought there would be some part of me that missed it, that wanted the comfort of the familiar. But there wasn't. She looked up at him. And once I knew it wasn't there, going back for some other reason, for practicality, or safety, or because it was the sensible choice, seemed worse than not going. It seemed like lying. I was quiet for a moment. The mountains changed you, he said. No. She shook her head. The mountains showed me what was already there. There's a difference. A pause. You know that. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I know that. The fire burned between them, and the mountains were somewhere in the dark outside, and the night was cold and clear and entirely, indifferently beautiful, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. That was enough. In the end, that was the whole of it. Not the trial, not the warrants, not the restored inheritance, or the investigative record, or the coverage in the Eastern newspapers that called her the woman who broke the Western syndicate in language she found both flattering and reductive. Those things mattered, some of them in the specific ways that things mattered when they produced real change in the lives of real people.